Welcome to European Journeys. This is the fifth stage of a series in which we explore the Christianization of Norway. For this stage, we are going to visit an area which is located not so far from the capital of Norway, that is Oslo, and that area is the county of Vestfold. Vest because it is located on the western shores of the Oslo Fjord, an arm of the sea that reaches Oslo, and the village we are going to visit is named Borre. Borre has about 3,000 inhabitants. It is at about 70 kilometers south from the capital of Norway. And there we find two sites that are explicit witnesses of the transformation that Norway had known towards the end of the first millennium and the beginning of the second millennium. These two sites are next to one another, in fact. They are at a walking distance from one another. The first one is named Borre Haugene, that is the Borre Mound Cemetery. It is a park containing 28 burial mounds. They are typical of the Viking Age. People of high society, even kings, were buried under such mounds, which are grassy hills today. We find them in Sweden and Denmark as well. And next to the mounds, what we find, in fact, is a church. But it's a church that it's one of the earliest churches that we find in this area, built in this area. It was built in the beginning of the 12th century. And it is of a typical Romanesque style, typical of the time, with thick white walls. And then we also see that we have there three buildings that are of decreasing size next to one another. And that's a feature that is pretty typical of the churches built at the time in this area. So, cemetery on one side, a church on the other. These are two witnesses that show the transition, the transformation that Norway has known. Norway became, in fact, a Christianized society in the beginning of the second millennium. And to become a Christianized nation, in fact, two things need to happen. Of course, one is the evangelization of the people. People need to come to know the gospel, the Lord, Jesus Christ. On the one hand, that's what needs to happen. But on the other hand, what needs to happen as well is the Christianization of all spheres of life, in particular of the laws of the country. Now, for the previous episodes, we've seen how the gospel began to impact the rulers of Norway, and therefore how it began also to impact the laws of the nation. But we haven't seen much about that first part that I said, that is the evangelization of the people. We talked a little bit about Håkon the Good, the first Christian king of Norway, who ruled in the 10th century. He was concerned about the evangelization of the people. He had brought back some priests with him from England and began to plant churches, but that was around the western coast of Norway. But in fact, his mission did not continue after his death. He had tried to Christianize also the laws of the land, but as we've seen in a previous episode, he had failed to do so. And then after his death in the year 961, a period of political instability began in Norway. The successor of Håkon the Good was a man named Harald Greycloak. He was a nominal Christian. He nevertheless did not really seek to advance Christianity in Norway. And after his death, he died a few years after he was enthroned in the year 970, killed along the coast of Denmark. After his death, the king of Denmark began to take power over Norway and placed a vassal king, a man named Håkon Jarl, who was a staunch pagan, and we talked about him in our previous episode. So, at first glance, when we look at these rulers, it doesn't seem that the gospel could have made much progress during those years in Norway. And yet, it is in those years that we find the first efforts of evangelization in that area of Vestfold. Now, why was it so? Well, let's talk about that king of Denmark that took the power over Norway for a brief time. His name was Harald Bluetooth. We talked about him in the last episode, and we've seen that he had adopted Christianity Rather by force, he had been defeated by the emperor, the German emperor Otto II, and accepted to be baptized. But apparently, he became very zealous for Christianity and wanted to Christianize his lands. Now, as I said, most of Norway was ruled by Håkon Jarl, a vassal king of Harald Bluetooth, but the areas of Vestfold and Viken, which is on the eastern part of the Oslo Fjord, were directly ruled from Denmark during the years of Harald Bluetooth. And so Harald Bluetooth decided to send missionaries to these lands as well. Now, what can we learn from these times, from this mission under the King of Denmark? Well, not much, sadly. We have three accounts, early writings that can help us. One is the Jomsviking saga. The other are the writings of Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic historian. And the third is the chronicler Adam of Bremen. The accounts sometimes don't match, but nevertheless we can depict a broad picture of what happened. In fact, among the missionaries that Harald Bluetooth sent were three names. One was named Odinkar, another one was Liavdag, who was a bishop of Ribe, an area in Denmark, and he is known to, or at least that's what we read in Adam of Bremen's account, to have performed miracles even in Norway. And the third one was Popo, a man named Popo, who had impressed greatly the King of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, also by his preaching and by the miracles he performed. So these three men went to Norway, according to Adam of Bremen. And in the Jomsviking saga, there are the names of two other men, names that we don't find anywhere else. They are named Urgutrjötr and Brimiskjar, very difficult names to pronounce, who also went there. But that's pretty much it. That's all what we can know about the missions that happened under the King of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth. Now, Harald died in the year 986, and that was shortly after the battle of Hjörungavåg that we talked about in our last episode. And after that, Håkon Jarl became the sole ruler over Norway and took over these lands here in Vestfold and Viken, and apparently that's also when the mission effort ended in this part of Norway. It does seem that the church did not survive, which seems to suggest that the missions had not been able to establish a firm foundation for the church there during those years. But nevertheless, these were the first efforts in that area, these first efforts of evangelization. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us, in fact, that at the first glance, these missions were a failure, at least in that part of Norway. As I said, other missionaries coming from England were also evangelizing, especially along the western coast. But this mission in particular seemed to be a failure, and yet the nation will be Christianized in the following decades, which shows that even though sometimes Christianity doesn't seem to advance, really the kingdom of God is meant to advance in this era. Jesus had promised so in the parable of the good seed, the seed that is planted in the ground and becomes a tree where all the birds of the earth come to find them, to put their nest there. Well, that's what's happened. The trees continued to grow in Norway, notwithstanding the seeming failure of that first mission in Vestfold and Viken. So, two sides for the Christianization of a nation: the evangelization of the people, which happened even though there were some setbacks at times, and then on the other hand, the Christianization of the laws of the land and of all spheres of life. This is what happened in Norway. This is what began to happen at the turn of the first and second millennia. And we are going to continue to explore that in our following stages. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next time for another stage of European Journeys.